blood testing for various types of cancer, prenatal testing. Those are two huge growth areas, very big markets, both in the EU and in the US. And we see that as the first place that we will go to commercialize the product.
Hello, you're watching Proactive. I'm joined by EMV Capital CEO Dr. Ilyan Ilyev, as well as Dname It CEO Steve Cook. Ilyan, Steve, very good to speak with you. I'll start with you, Ilyan. We know that EMV Capital has a strong focus on backing companies that are tackling real problems faced by healthcare systems. What makes Dname It such a valuable asset within the portfolio?
Thank you, Stephen. Well, if I start from the big picture, one of the things that stuck in my mind from the COVID epidemic was it was the first time we had really attempted as a society truly mass screening with PCR-based and other more complex types of diagnostics. And what we saw at that point is that when you push the system to the limit, a number of cracks appear. There were lots of stories about false positives, false negatives with potentially lethal consequences. What people perhaps think less about is that since then, and over the last 10 years, whether it's in cancer diagnostics or in antenatal monitoring or other areas, there is a very high growth of NGS or the gene sequencing type of analytics and monitoring. And when you have large-scale monitoring or large-scale diagnostics of the population of this sort, with the tens of thousands, if not millions of samples going through, errors become really important. Errors can be fatal. So what struck me when we came across Dname It is that they have a modern solution to a modern problem. Steve will talk a lot about it, a lot more. I sort of think about it as a blockchain for the blood economy, if you will, but really kind of a foolproof way of eliminating errors in that space. It is also one that can be integrated, in our view, with the management information systems of the modern healthcare system.
Well, Steve, let's bring you in here. For those unfamiliar with Dname It, can you start by explaining the problem Dname It is solving and why it's becoming increasingly important?
Yeah, of course. Hi, Stephen. Ilyan, I think, has done a pretty good job of teeing this up, actually. Just to deepen a little bit on top of what Ilyan's already said, as he mentioned, we're seeing a massive growth in the clinical testing industry and DNA sequencing testing based on blood samples for things like cancer, prenatal screening, rare disease identification, that kind of thing. And the growth in these so-called next generation sequencing type tests is phenomenal across the world. And these kinds of tests operate at scale. And as Ilyan mentioned, when you're dealing with thousands and thousands of patient samples, the scale that requires introduces all kinds of risks. So patient misidentification, sample contamination, that kind of thing. And unless those risks are mitigated, the result of that is huge anxiety and confusion for patients, possibly even with fatal consequences, as Ilyan mentioned, but also increased costs for laboratories as they have to retest samples, and a critical lack of confidence in that kind of testing methodology. And the confidence of all the stakeholders in the clinical industry around those tests is so important for those things to become successful. And so the methods that are used by laboratories at the moment to mitigate those kinds of risks are all kind of external to the samples. So it's labels on the test tubes, it's strict protocols and methodologies, that kind of thing. But all of that is quite vulnerable to human error. And so what Dname It does is produce, Ilyan called it blockchain for the blood economy. And what Dname It does is it produces molecular barcodes. So these are molecules which are patient specific. The sequences of those molecules are patient specific. And we introduce those into the testing protocol at the molecular level. And so what you end up with is quality assurance and safety of these kinds of tests built in at the molecular level. So that's how we're solving for those problems.
Steve, how does your technology actually work in practice? What does it do differently that gives researchers or clinicians greater confidence?
So the first thing to say is it's a very simple addition to existing methodologies in laboratories. So we're not asking laboratories or clinicians to do radically different things in terms of sample collection or the protocols that they use. What happens is we introduce those molecular barcodes in the testing kit that is provided to laboratories. So in the sample tubes, every sample tubes will have DNAME it patient-specific molecules inside, and through the testing protocol, those will get incorporated into the sequencing process. And it's a very simple, straightforward way of introducing that molecular level assurance into the process.
You've mentioned plans for a commercial pilot in 2026 and a partnership that will help to monetize your IP. Could you share a little bit more about these plans and the key steps towards wider commercial deployment?
Of course, yeah. So taking the pilots first, we've already come quite a long way with the technology since it was conceptualized. So we have the regulatory approvals we need to operate in the kind of laboratory environment that we're talking about. We have already proven that we can manufacture those molecular barcodes in an effective way. And so the next step is to take it into the laboratory environment and work through the entire laboratory procedure that's required to prepare samples for sequencing using the DNAME's barcodes, if you like. And so that's what the pilots are all about. We have over 500 samples prepared, and we're talking to laboratory partners who are going to work with us to carry out that trial with the right liquid handling methodology and so on. So that will happen this year, and that will provide critical data in order to enable us to then go and form the kind of commercial partnerships that we need to take the product to market. So that's the focus for the pilot. In terms of intellectual property, our founder, Professor Harry Cuppins, is a prolific inventor and an exceptional talent in the field that we're talking about. And through our analysis, some of the patents that he's produced, we think have quite meaningful application and are being used effectively without permission by a number of large testing companies, because those patents actually describe methods which are absolutely critical for the economic large-scale testing that we're talking about. So we think at the moment that DNAME has an opportunity to go out into the market and enforce those rights, and through that process, monetize that intellectual property and return that value to DNAME its shareholders. So that's a separate strand of activity that we're pursuing. The good news is that others agree with our analysis, and we're in some fairly intensive negotiation right now with one of the largest intellectual property investors globally, who agrees with our analysis, like I say. And we're expecting that will lead to a partnership to help us to actively pursue our rights in the market.
As your technology moves closer to adoption, Steve, where do you see the biggest market opportunity?
Well, I think we've talked about some of them already. Blood testing for various types of cancer, prenatal testing. Those are two huge growth areas, very big markets, both in the EU and in the US. And we see that as the first place that we will go to commercialize the product. But then beyond that, we can very much envisage taking the product into other use cases, so into rare disease identification, other kinds of screening technology, and even beyond the medical realm, we can see applications in agri-tech and other sectors as well. So we can see huge growth beyond that initial market entry that we envisage.
Ilian, there's clearly a lot of progress happening at DNAME it. How does EMV Capital support the team as they move along that journey towards commercialization?
Well, Stephen, the DNAME it is part of our venture build program that we've talked about in the past. And this is where we take companies with an already proven technology and a product where we believe there is a good product market fit, but where the company needs some further support in accelerating growth. And we provide that support through our corporate finance side in terms of helping the company access funding, but also through our value creation services, providing the company with resources to get to the next stage. And we've been working with Dean Nemeth for a couple of years now, helping to both mature its thinking around the around its IP strategy, and Steve has some expertise in the patent licensing space, but also working with the team around maturing its thinking about the go-to-market in the lab space. So in that sense, we're not afraid to get our hands dirty. We're not afraid to roll up our sleeves. Always working collaboratively with the management team in helping to make the company a success.
Ilya and Steve, I hope you'll keep us updated on the progress with that journey. Thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Thank you.
That's EMV Capital CEO Dr. Ilyan Ilyev and Dean Nemeth CEO Steve Cook.